webinar via email, just in case you want to watch it again or share it with some of your colleagues. Each of you should be able to see a control panel that looks like this on your screen, this control panel. You can expand or contract the control panel as shown by using this orange grab tab here. You're free to ask and submit questions via the question box located here. Keep those questions coming throughout the webinar. We'll be addressing your questions at the end of the presentation. Before we start, let's see here. We have a few quick questions, a pre-webinar survey for you that's going to help us let us know a little bit more about the audience today and the current level of understanding for our topic. Now, these questions will just pop right up on your screen. We'll just give you about 15 to 20 seconds to respond to each question and then show the results to the groups. So let's see here. The very first question, the very first question, I wonder if you could answer the questions via chat box here and just give us a yes or no answer to your question. So if you could answer yes or no in the chat box, currently or will you in the future assist diversified vegetable growers with their farming operations? And this is a simple yes or no that you could submit via the chat box, and we'll be taking your answers in and tabulating them and show you the answers to those questions maybe towards the end of the webinar. So that's question one. And as I say, you can just send those questions via the chat box and let us know yes or no. Do you currently or will you be assisting diversified vegetable growers with their farming operations? The second question is, what's your confidence level in assisting growers with identifying farm data needed to make well-informed business decisions? And this is like none, low, medium, or high. So that's question two there for you. And we welcome your participation in this. If you could just submit those answers via the chat box, and we'll be tabulating those. The third and final question we'd like to get is, what is your confidence level in assisting growers with identifying farmer-friendly tools and resources to help track needed data? That's no confidence, low, medium, or high confidence. So that's question three. There are only three questions, and we appreciate your input for these three questions, and we'll give you those responses towards the end of the webinar. We appreciate your participation. Let's see. Now I'll pass the presentation on to John Hendrickson.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Hendrickson. Thanks for the introduction from Steve and Julia. Just a little bit more about myself. I work at the Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We're a sustainable agriculture research and education center. I do a lot of training programs, especially for beginning farmers. I also have my own farm, Stone Circle Farm, as Steve mentioned. It's quite small, but because I wear those two hats, I'm not just a person at a university coming up with these ideas. I live and breathe it when I'm at my farm during the growing season. I also have a business in which I provide goods and services for small-scale farmers. That's called Small Farm Works. If you want to know what I look like, you can walk into a Whole Foods store and buy some of this Beaver Dam Pepper heirloom hot sauce. That's me on the label. So there's a lot of different ways that you can address the issue of profitability with farmers. You can talk to them about yield, which has a lot to do with variety selection, fertility, irrigation, and pest management. We can talk about tools and equipment to make production go more smoothly and efficiently. We can talk about managing labor on farms and training workers, or we can talk about how we're trying to market our products. A question that I like to ask is whether direct markets are really more profitable than wholesale. I think a lot of people assume one thing, but it may not always be true. But today's topic is actually a little bit maybe less sexy than those topics, and something that hasn't really been, not much work has been done on. But I think it's really, really important, especially for these diversified vegetable growers that are growing so many different crops and selling in so many different ways, and that's record keeping. The only way to truly know whether you're profitable is to be keeping records, monitoring those records, analyzing them, and making changes. So some questions that I like to pose to growers is, do you know what crops are most profitable on your farm? Do you know which ones are the least profitable? Do you know which are the most profitable markets in which you sell? Do you know the cost to produce all those different vegetables that you grow on your farm? Are there crops that might be profitable in one market and not in another? And finally, do you know how good your yields are and how they might compare with an average benchmark? Now, in my experience, if we ask growers those questions, sometimes we don't get very many answers. And when we do get answers, we need to know how those answers are being based. Are they being based on information, or is it just a guess? Some people you talk to might not have any answers to those questions. Some people might have an answer, but it might be just kind of what other growers say, or what they grew up with, what their dad said if they grew up farming for their dad or their mom. It might be just gut instinct. It might be a sophisticated, wild, blank guess. There might be a little bit of work behind it in terms of some back-of-the-envelope calculations. Or, gosh, wouldn't it be great if we actually could answer those questions with actual data from the farm? I want to run through some realities. If you all are people that work with fresh market vegetable farms, you'll be familiar with what these realities are. We've got diversified vegetable farms growing lots of different crops. If folks are doing farmers markets or community-supported agriculture programs, they might be growing 50 or more vegetable crops on their farm. Many farms sell via more than one way. They might have a 50-member CSA, they might go to 3 farmers markets, and they might sell to some local restaurants. Or there might even be some U-pick things going on their farm. Lots of different marketing options. Now, when you look at all these different crops and all these different markets, those are going to have some shared overhead and direct costs, but each of those crops and each of those markets is most likely going to have their own unique costs. And prices are going to vary from market to market. Prices might vary for a particular product from season to season within a growing season. And unfortunately, one of the realities that we've witnessed is that many growers keep imperfect, incomplete records. Labor, which is the biggest expense on a vegetable farm, given all the work that you need to do to transplant and weed and harvest, and wash and pack and market, is the biggest expense. And unfortunately, it's also the most difficult in terms of record keeping. As a result of all those realities above, we've got growers who really can't answer those questions that I posed earlier. They don't know what crops on their farm are most profitable or have a good sense whether their pricing is adequately covering the cost of production. Because of those realities, we at the University of Wisconsin began working with a gentleman named Jim Munch to create something that we ended up calling VeggieCompass. VeggieCompass is a spreadsheet tool designed to help diversified vegetable growers determine their costs of production by crop and by market. So it's a way to look at profitability in a holistic way on these diversified farms. Now, our topic today is record keeping, and I want to make sure to note that VeggieCompass is an analytical tool, and it's not a record keeping system. But in order to use VeggieCompass to get to these questions, you've got to have a record keeping system in place, and you've got to use it. And so that's what I'm going to be spending most of the time on today. VeggieCompass is a free downloadable spreadsheet. Southern SOG, our partner in working to promote and advance the use of VeggieCompass, has a website. It's part of their Growing Farm Profits program, and they have a link to VeggieCompass, and you can download the spreadsheet there. You can also find VeggieCompass on kind of the mothership website for the program, VeggieCompass.com, which is based here at the University of Wisconsin. So VeggieCompass is a tool that requires a set of inputs and then gives you a set of outputs. On the input side, you have to be able to put in your farm expenses, your sales by crop, the growing area of each of those crops, You have to designate whether there's really specific expenses by crop. You have to know the number of plants you're putting through your greenhouse in terms of crops that are transplanted versus direct seeded. You have to know the amount of labor hours you're putting in to growing those transplants in the greenhouse. You have to know the labor hours on your farm by crop, and not only by crop, but VeggieCompass asks you to segregate those hours by field growing hours versus harvest and pack hours. And then finally, certainly on all farms, there's hours spent during the day that couldn't be pegged to broccoli or carrots or radishes, but are not crop-specific hours, and VeggieCompass asks you to tabulate those as well. That's a pretty significant set of inputs. We like to believe that the outputs are worth it. The outputs that VeggieCompass gives you are the cost of a crop up to harvest, the total cost of a crop through harvest and pack, the cost to produce each crop in terms of dollars per pound or dollars per bunch, depending on how a crop is sold, the total labor cost by crop, and then finally a gross margin and profit analysis by market channel for your farm. We don't have time today to do a detailed walkthrough of VeggieCompass, but I just wanted to show you a few slides so you can get a sense of what it looks like. It's a spreadsheet with 6 pages across the bottom. Well, I guess there's more pages if you include the instructions. The first input page, it looks like this, and this is where you put in your expenses along that left white column. And then VeggieCompass asks you to allocate those expenses across the different aspects of your farm, which are the colored columns out to the right. The second input page is where you list all the crops that you're growing and put the price in or the sales figures in for each of those crops. So I'm just going to scroll over so you can see that it tallies things up there to the right. The last input page is where you put in some specific information about seed costs, about the number of plants that are going through a greenhouse if they're transplanted, the area allocated to those different crops, and then columns to put in those labor hours that VeggieCompass demands that you put in. Those are the input pages. The next 3 pages are all output pages with calculations based on those first 3 input pages. The first is a cost of production page that carries you through seed, greenhouse, field growing, through harvest and pack, and to a total. There's a sales output page which carries forward all those products that you're selling, gives you the average price that you sold those for, the unit cost of production, the unit net profit, crop net profit, and it does that by sales outlet. So for this farm example, we have CSA, farmers market, wholesale, and on-farm stand, and then a total. Whoops. The last page is this profit and loss by market channel sheet, which gives you kind of a summary of each of those market channels and shows you how those different channels are either contributing or detracting from the profitability of your farm. It's no small task to use VeggieCompass, but we believe that without doing this, that you're kind of in the dark in terms of assessing profitability on your farm. We've talked with many growers that have used VeggieCompass, and they've learned which crops on their farm are truly profitable. They've learned which markets are most profitable. They have identified where their prices need to be tweaked, usually up, to cover costs of production. And people, growers using VeggieCompass have adjusted their cropping mixes and marketing to take advantage of those areas of their farm and those crops that are most profitable, and in some cases have drop crops or drop markets that are less profitable or are net losers. Again, VeggieCompass is an analytical tool, and it needs data. And in order to get that data, we need to do some record keeping. The big record keeping piece that we're going to talk about today is labor. And we're going to talk about that because the biggest expense on these farms is labor. The most variable expense from crop to crop is labor. Therefore, the most critical factor for you as a business owner is that labor. And unfortunately, it's the hardest one to track. Most growers are pretty good many growers are pretty good about tracking those other expenses on their farm, but the labor one is a difficult one. So record keeping is the key, and labor record keeping is a big part of that key. Many growers start the season with really good intentions. This is the year that I'm going to keep rock solid data. Unfortunately, as the season gets more intense and they get busier and busier, often the record keeping gets abandoned. Maybe not all the record keeping gets abandoned. People are usually still tracking sales and still monitoring expenses, but in terms of tracking their day-to-day labor on their farm by crop, that often gets left behind. So it's really important to keep systems simple and easy, and it's really important to designate a person or two to be responsible so that there's some accountability. I'm going to talk a little bit about, most people have heard of best management practices. I'm going to talk about best labor record keeping practices, BLRKPs. For this kind of detailed labor record keeping, crop by crop, we advocate developing easy-to-use forms. Those can be paper or electronic. I personally think electronic gives you a step forward, but I know we have many growers that are not using computers yet. So you can use paper forms. I think it's really important to get organized when you're not so busy. So that means starting kind of right now. Get organized for the next season. Don't wait until May to say, oh, I need some way to keep records. I'm going to develop some forms, but you're already so busy that you don't have time to do it. You need to make it part of your routine, ideally part of your daily routine on the farm. Many farmers have a set chores that they do on a regular basis, feeding the chickens in the morning, taking a walk through the field to do some pest monitoring. You need to make this record keeping part of that daily routine. Really critical to not start putting it off until tomorrow. As soon as you do that once, it can be a slippery slope. The next day is liable to be even busier than today, and if you put it off again and again, then you're not going to remember what you did on Monday, and it's too late. One thing that I'm a big advocate for, apologize for that, big advocate for is requiring employees to do basic record keeping on farms, such as recording their field activities, the harvest amounts, and tracking time by crop. On my farm, when I first started hiring employees, I made this a part of the timesheet that my employee had to submit in order to get paid. She had to write down not just how many hours she worked, but what crops she worked on and what she was doing with those crops. My particular employee took advantage of her cell phone to make that easy for her, so she would arrive to work and record on her phone, I'm going out to weed carrots right now, it's 8 o'clock. She'd get done with that task, and she'd take out her phone again and record, it's 9:30, done weeding carrots. I'm off to the greenhouse to seed broccoli for the next planting. So at the end of the day, she would sit and listen to her phone and fill out her time card. If you can't do it on your farm, I think it's really important to find someone who can and will. Everyone hears that farmers are jacks or Jills of all trades. I know a few farmers that are really good at everything, but most farmers are good at some things and not so good at other things. And I think it's important to have divisions of labor and take advantages of different strengths and weaknesses on a farm. Maybe the farmer's spouse is a better record keeping, maybe their son or daughter is, maybe they have a friend who's really interested in their farm and could come and do that, or maybe it's an employee and it's part of their job responsibility. Another thing that I think is a really important best labor record-keeping practices is to use the information to make changes. If you keep all this information and just set it aside and never look at it and never assess where you are and make changes and improvements to your farm, you're not going to be very motivated to keep doing that record keeping. So use the information and you'll find it worthwhile. I know growers that are really organized in their shops in terms of their tools. We need to make our offices just as organized and have systems in place to keep information easy to record and easy to get to. Now, if this kind of day-to-day detailed record keeping, crop by crop, through the whole season is just too much for a farm, it's possible to get started in a smaller way. You can measure labor impulses through the season. You could invite a person who's interested in your farm to come and hold the stopwatch and time you and your crew, or a farmer and their crew, on repeated tasks. And you could make a table with standard times for repeated tasks. How long does it take us to transplant 100 bed feet? How much time does it take us to harvest a bed of green beans? How much time does it take us to seed a flat? And so you can develop standard times for those tasks that are repeated over and over again on a farm. And when you're doing this, it's important to take measurements at different times of the season. Anyone that's worked on a farm knows that there can be considerable variability in terms of who's working that day, what the conditions are like. I grow a lot of carrots. It takes a lot longer to harvest carrots in muddy conditions than in dry conditions. You can also choose to perhaps, when you maybe get started using a system like VeggieCompass and tracking labor, you might decide, well, this year we're only going to look at root crops because I'm really concerned that our pricing may not be covering the cost of producing those. So maybe we're going to track labor on root crops this year. That'd be another way to take a smaller bite and not be so overwhelming. So there's lots of different tools to use to record that labor data. I think it's important for growers to experiment and find what works for them. What works for one grower might not work for the next guy, the next gal over. Many growers use log books. They keep crop journals, or they have mileage logs in their cars, and so they're used to having those types of forms and notebooks around. You could include in your daily crop journal a note of what you worked on and how many hours. And maybe you're not watching the clock per se, but even a rough idea by the half hour or quarter hour of what you're doing could be a way to get started. Most people have a calendar where they keep track of what's going on, maybe who's working on the farm. That would be another location where you could make notes on a daily basis. Just like you keep track of appointments on a calendar, you can keep track of what happened over the previous day on a calendar. You can use whiteboards. I know a number of farms that use whiteboards in their washing and pack sheds to keep track of information, maybe who's working that day and what's being harvested and what orders we have to fulfill. You can use a whiteboard to track information through the day so that when crops come in, you've got a list of crops on the whiteboard in the morning. When those crops come in, you use the dry erase marker to mark down how many pounds came in and how long it took. I know a farm that uses a whiteboard like this, and they went the extra step to, before they erased the board on the end of the day, they took a digital photo of that whiteboard so that they had a permanent record of what happened that day. I already talked a little bit about having employees keep track of labor data, so you can use time cards. Oh, I've got actually a picture of a whiteboard here from a farm that uses this on their farm. So just a quick example. And here's an example of a timesheet that a farm in Wisconsin uses. All their employees are required to use this in order to get paid. They put their name on, and then they don't track total hours, but they track hours by crop. This particular farm uses some Hispanic workers, so they've got all the vegetables listed in both English and Spanish. Spreadsheets are really common on farmers that do use computers. Many use spreadsheets. Spreadsheets, of course, are rows of columns and rows and columns to keep data. Really common on farms. I'll be talking a little bit more about that as we move forward. Of course, if you're going to use a spreadsheet, that really necessitates having a computer, and there are various software programs that I'll talk a little bit about here moving forward. And finally, we've got the new age. We've got handheld devices and lots of different ways that we can use those on farms. And again, I'll give some specific examples of ways that those can be used as we go forward. Really important to make this a habit and make it a routine. Well, if you're using paper forms, let's say you don't have a computer and you're not willing to use a computer, or you've got clients that you're working with that aren't in the computer age, one really quick thing that you can do to make paper forms easier to do is to make them easy to fill out. And so just contrast this form on the left with the form on the right. Both keep the same information: the crop, the task, and the hours. On the left-hand side, you've got to write the crop, you've got to write the task, and you've got to write the hours. On the form on the left or the right, you've just got to circle the crop, circle the activity or the task, and then you write in the number. So it makes it much faster and easier to do. We created some forms like this specifically for the VeggieCompass project, and you can actually download these forms from the VeggieCompass website. One we call the long form, which is one form per day, captures all the different crops and all the different activities on one form. Crops are listed on the left, field growing hours are noted, harvest and pack hours are noted. We decided to add a column so that a grower could use it to make notes if they wanted to. The short form is like the form on the previous page where you're just circling things quickly, and in this case you maybe do many of these forms in a given day. And what we created when we were working with some farmers to test VeggieCompass is we created pads of these at a local copy shop, and so growers would fill it out, tear it off, and throw it in a bucket or a basket in their central location on their farm. All their employees would have one of these pads with them in their pocket so that if they finished a task, they could quickly make a note of it and throw it into a bin. The downside of these paper forms is that if you're going to do anything with this information, you've got to tabulate all these numbers over the course of a season. Another reason why I advocate growers getting into the computer age and doing the tabulation on a computer, or even doing the record keeping, the initial record keeping on a computer. If you're using paper forms, might help to have color coding. Here's a farm that I visited that has different colored forms for different things that are happening on their farm. Got a clipboard for each, hanging on the wall right there in front of your face, so you need to pull those off the wall and use them. I talked about accountability. This farm is big on that, and they have folks put their initials when they're filling out the form, and then sign the form at the bottom. So then if you've got a question, or you're wondering what happened with this, or you can't read something, you know who to go to figure out how to fill the hole in that record, those records. So spreadsheets are really common. This is just an example of a spreadsheet that I actually use on my farm. This is more of a planning tool rather than a record-keeping tool. I think it's good to kind of layer record-keeping on top of planning, because you're usually organizing your plan by crop and by maybe bed on or location on your farm. And so if you just include columns or rows to then record the labor that went on in terms of that crop, or the harvest amounts that went on in terms of that crop, and you can have everything in one place. But rather than just leave off with the spreadsheet, I am a huge advocate for using forms and or you might call smart forms. One really easy way to get involved in using forms is through Google Docs. And Google Docs is a free platform that Google offers for creating Word documents or spreadsheets or simple drawing programs. And forms is a way to create a simple way to populate a spreadsheet with information. When you create a form, every question that you create on a form becomes a column in a spreadsheet, and every time you fill out that form and click Submit, it fills in a row on a spreadsheet. It allows a grower and their employees to input data as it happens on a computer, a tablet, or a smartphone, as long as you've got an internet connection. And these forms can be used not just to track labor, but it can be used to record all kinds of different information on your farm. I even use it on my farm to take orders from customers. I have a really lengthy presentation that there's a link to from VeggieCompass.com on how to create a Google Doc form. Real quickly, this is kind of a mock-up of what a form looks like after you created it. This one's titled Stone Circle Farm Work Log. It's a form that I created to track labor on my farm. It asks who you are, who's filling out this form, what the date is if it's different than today, because Google Doc Forms actually includes a timestamp. So when you submit, you know exactly when it was submitted. There's a drop-down menu to select a crop, a place to check what activity was being performed, and again, this gets back to VeggieCompass needing to designate whether you were field growing or doing harvest and pack, or those greenhouse hours. I chose on my farm to also track office and admin time and a category I called repair, maintenance, and construction. And then finally, how much time was done. And then there's a submit button at the bottom. You click submit, and it goes into a database, a spreadsheet. Here's actually the link to the YouTube video that I just mentioned earlier on the previous slide about the video I created about how to create a Google Doc form. This is what the spreadsheet looks like. So the form, this form is linked via Google Docs to a spreadsheet. And so this is what you end up with. On the left is the answer to who filled out the form, what crop they were working on, what activity they were doing, the amount of time, et cetera, et cetera. This is a screenshot of what a Google Doc form actually looks like, and they have different themes. This is just a blue theme. You can get more fancy with these if you want to. So this is what a form might look like that you could create. Again, who's filling out the form, how many people are working, what crop, how much time, what activity we're doing, and then you can choose to collect other information, how many flats were seeded, or how many beds were cultivated, or how many pounds were harvested. This is a form I use to take orders from customers on my farm. So there's lots of different ways that growers can take advantage of using these smart forms through Google Docs. There's some other options beyond Google. I don't want to be I don't work for Google. I'm not getting paid to advertise their product and services. Zoho Creator is another system that will allow you to create forms that are linked to databases. Zoho requires a subscription, $5 per user per month. So there's a cost to that. It's a little bit more powerful and more versatile than Google Docs. So if a farm wanted to do a little bit more and be a little bit more fancy than what they can accomplish in Google Docs, they could choose to use that. There's a product called Ag Squared, which is a system that was developed by some graduates of Cornell University that quite a number of farms are starting to use. I think it was launched about 5 to maybe 7 years ago. It's gradually being improved, and new services are being layered on into the Ag Squared program. It was initially more of just a crop planning tool, but now they've layered in various record-keeping functions and financial analysis functions. Each of those requires a larger subscription level in their system. And I'll show you some screenshots of what Ag Squared looks like in just a second. Another one that I'll show you some screenshots of is called Farm Data, which right now is free, but requires quite extensive web skills and a specific type of web server to install and get set up. So I've actually not even been able to really test drive it because I don't have those web skills to get it set up. This is what Zoho Creator looks like. Again, you can create a form very quickly and easily, just like those Google Doc forms that I created and showed earlier to track labor data. This is what Ag Squared looks like. There's various tabs to do your crop planning, determine when you're planting different crops, input harvest dates and harvest amounts. You can record activities, so you can give an activity a name and describe it and give it a location. You can indicate what staff on your farm were doing that activity, what tools and equipment were being used, what supplies were being used. As a side note, this type of information could be very useful for certified organic farms in terms of tracking what they're doing on their farm, what amendments are being used, pest control inputs are being used on their farm. And this is what you could do in terms of tracking labor and costs using Ag Squared. Here's just some fictional numbers for garlic, how much labor hours were put in, what were those labor hours, how were those labor hours accounted for, sowing, mulching, etc., what equipment was used, what supplies were used, and a total cost to grow that crop. Farm data I'm pretty excited about, and I wish it didn't take such skills to get set up. I'm hoping that eventually they'll develop an app, and I believe that's in the works, so that you can just download this and start using it. Right now you have to have some web skills to get going. And it's kind of a complete system for reporting not only labor but crop production records, the whole planning process, harvest records, field activities. You can keep track of your soil amendments and cover cropping using this system, packing and distribution, and even has customer invoicing. So it's kind of a complete package as opposed to having maybe one system for tracking labor and then QuickBooks for financials and then maybe an online payroll service to do your payroll. Actually, I take that back. This does not have payroll servicing, I don't believe. So you can play around with farm data, or at least see what it looks like at this first bold website, which will show you the Dickinson College Farm, which developed this tool. It'll show you, give you kind of free access to their data, although you won't be able to edit or make any changes. And then the link at the bottom is where you can download and get it set up if you have those skills and abilities. This is what farm data looks like, a bunch of tabs across the top. Every time you click on a new tab, so harvest, seed, or labor, it'll then give you something to click on that's an input form, and the input form is where you're submitting the data, whether it be for harvesting or seeding or labor requirements. So here's just an example of what the form for labor input looks like. You can say where you were working, what crop you were working on, what task you were doing, the number of workers, and the amount of time. So pretty complete. Field Day is another system that I've just recently had a conversation with a developer of. It's a young guy in Chicago who's working on this, and he hopes to have it ready by the end of the year. The working title for it is Field Day, although it hasn't been fully launched, so I guess there's a chance that name might be changed. And this is both a crop planning and record-keeping system that's going to be web-based, will require internet access, although they eventually hope to have an app for it that works so you could use it without internet access. And one thing that they've built into this, or are building into it, is a database of 600 different vegetable varieties. So they've got thousands of different tomato varieties and carrot varieties listed in there, so that when you're doing the initial crop planning, you can select not just crops, but you can select varieties, and it will automatically bring in the days to maturity for those crops. It's also going to build in some revenue projections. You'll be able to set some prices in the background, and based on theoretical harvest numbers, you could, before you even plant a crop, project what it will bring in terms of gross. Record keeping for that is going to be layered in on top of the crop planning, and while the crop planning function is likely to be free, the other services in terms of record keeping and fancier functions, there'll be a subscription monthly payment fee for. Right now there's some prototypes at this website, Todd's Farm Tools. At this website you can get a sense of kind of what it's might look like in the future. Again, these are just prototypes, and so it's liable to change in terms of the features and functionality and the visuals. You plug in your zip code, automatically gives you average first frost and average last frost for fall and spring for your location, which can help guide you in terms of your seeding and transplant dates as you're making a plan. This is another tool that Todd has built. This is a distribution calculator. This tool allows you to plug in your location, and then if you were going to do a bunch of deliveries, say into Chicago, as the example is here, You could put in all the different locations. It'll come up with the total miles. You put in the drive time and the amount of time that it takes you to unload at each location. Put in what kind of vehicle you have and who's driving and what their pay rate is. And at the bottom of this form, you'll come up with an analysis of how much you need to sell if you're going to do that delivery route, how much you need to sell to break even based on your vehicle, those many miles with that driver on that day. Pretty neat stuff. That's kind of a whirlwind tour of various record-keeping tools. The big question is this type of record-keeping does require time and effort. And as my friend Jim Munch likes to ask, is the juice worth the squeeze? If we're going to try really hard and spend all this time doing this record keeping, are we going to get anything out of it? Well, we did a survey of vegetable growers in Wisconsin a couple years ago, and one of the findings from that survey was that farms that are satisfied with their record keeping systems tend to be satisfied with their profitability. So we believe there's a link, and that those farms that are doing this type of record keeping and analysis are in a much better position to set prices that will ensure that they're profitable and sustainable in the long run. In terms of VeggieCompass in the future, we hope that there will be an app for that as well. Obviously, lots of different ways to get this done. I've given you some examples today. I know that there's others out there, and I didn't intentionally try to leave anyone out or include anyone. If you've got contact or if you've got questions for me beyond the webinar, I'm happy to take those questions. And we'll turn to questions now through the question box on the GoToMeeting website.
Okay, thank you, John. I appreciate that. So it is time for questions, and we'll start with those that are already in the question box, but feel free to ask others too if you need them, or if you have them. You can just go down onto your, as Julia was showing earlier, if you go to the control panel down on the lower side, on the lower part of it, you'll find a questions tab. Just hit on that plus sign, and you should be able to ask a question there if you've not been able to. So the first question that came up, John, here is, have you seen this? It's a website, farmhack.org, tools, record keeping, and profitability efficiency analysis tool. Have you been there at all?
I am quite familiar with FarmHack, but I haven't visited that specific page, so I cannot comment.
Okay. Looks like when I saw that question come up, I looked at it and I was not familiar with it, so it was neat. There are a lot of different things there, so that's great. Next question, where can we find the survey results that were just mentioned?
The survey results that we did of vegetable growers in Wisconsin, there has been a write-up of those. Off the top of my head, I cannot spout the location for those, but if folks want to contact me directly, I would be happy to provide a link or a copy of the write-up about those survey results.
You can also send any of your questions here to us at info@southernsog.org, and we'll make sure they get to John if you don't have his email address there. Okay. John, how has Extension in Wisconsin been getting this kind of information to farmers? How have you been getting it out up there?
Well, primarily through conferences and workshops, which, I'm sure Wisconsin's no different than any of the other states represented on the webinar today. There's no end to the number of conferences and workshops that you can attend, especially in the winter months. In particular, we have one of the largest farming conferences in the country, the Upper Midwest Organic Farming Conference, held in La Crosse on an annual basis. and we've presented there on VeggieCompass on a couple of occasions. I regularly get asked to speak to groups, specifically around, especially specifically beginning farmers, and so I really like to advocate beginning growers getting started in solid record keeping from the ground up. It can be harder, as we all know, to teach old dogs new tricks, and so I really like working with beginning growers and getting them started on the right foot with record keeping.
Okay. The whole the VeggieCompass seems pretty complicated. Is there any way to simplify it for folks, or any suggestions along that line?
Well, I give you a few suggestions during the presentation. If you've got a highly diversified farm, maybe you bite off a small chunk of it the first time that you use VeggieCompass, and maybe you only look at a particular marketing channel or a particular set of crops. Or maybe the first time you use VeggieCompass, it's all sophisticated wild blank guesses in terms of the labor hours in particular. Of course, garbage in, garbage out in terms of what you get out of the tool, but at least it could show you, some results that are based on guesses, and then maybe you think, I don't know if I believe so profitable or so not profitable, so maybe this is going to motivate me to actually do that record keeping. Again, what it comes down to is if a grower is serious about treating their farm as a business, and if they're serious about being more profitable, I don't see a way around tracking this kind of information. Now, there are some farms, I know a farm, really very successful farm that operates almost exclusively under the CSA model, the Community Supported Agriculture model. This farm also happens to do a really good job with record keeping. But they haven't felt a need to analyze their farm by crop because they're putting together boxes of vegetables on a weekly basis, and they take a more holistic view of their farm, and they look at their profit and loss statements. They know they look at their QuickBooks, and they know that their whole farm as a whole is quite profitable, and so they haven't felt a need to do the deep dive into this crop by crop analysis. Now, I do know some other farms that do CSA that have actually found it really worthwhile to do this deep dive, so they can better understand the value that they're putting in their box on a weekly basis, and are better able to set the price for their CSA box, and better able to track whether they're really giving their members the same kind of value over the whole season, or maybe their value dips for a while, but they can make up for that by putting more value in their CSA box at a later time. So,
okay.
We always get that question, is there a way to simplify this? Yes, but if you simplify it, you're probably not getting the full picture.
Great. Do you know how many farms are using VeggieCompass by any chance?
We've just are switching the system behind our VeggieCompass website so that we can better track downloads. We wanted to make it free and accessible. It's a free download, and so we don't have any gates for people to jump through to download. How many people are using it?
One attendant or participant mentioned that you can watch the tutorials on the Southern Sog website for another good way to learn more about VeggieCompass, and that is a good point.
And I feel really bad. I apologize to you, Steve. I was going to mention that during the presentation. Yes, my friend Ellen Polishuk, who's a part of the Growing Farm Profits program, narrates a wonderful set of videos that walk you through VeggieCompass, and I think really make the case strongly why a grower should, go the extra mile and push the pencil and push the keyboard and track this information.
There's a comment here that there's a great publication by John. Is this you, John, I guess? Grower to Grower, Creating a Livelihood on Fresh Market Vegetable Farm. Did you write that? Or is that somebody else?
I did, and I thank whoever's tooting my horn.
Well, you've got to go see that one. That's perfect. Right. Another question. I think this is a comment. Yeah, early on, you should help a veggie grower decide what kind of records to keep. So I think it was along the lines of what you were saying in terms of working with beginning farmers. Help them get used to or knowing what they need to do early on. And I would agree with that. Another question here. Have you heard of Mobile Farmware Inc. or Mobile Farmware Inc.? Are they still in business? They cater to large produce farms with scanned plastic cards carried by each farm worker with their picture and a personal barcode on it. Interesting.
I'm not familiar with that specific company, but I do know about that technology. I've actually, in conversations with colleagues here at the university and graduate students that have been helping us work on VeggieCompass, we've gone way down the road in terms of a fantasy world of how to easily track this information on a farm. Maybe having the QR codes, the squares with all the little speckles all over them. A system where you'd have QR codes, one on at each bed on your farm, and when you went into that area to do any work, you'd scan the QR code, and when you left, you'd scan again, and it would track how much time you spent there doing that work. You could even, in terms of tracking use of equipment and machinery and inputs, you could even have QR codes for tractors and equipment on your farm. You could have QR codes for pest management products, and you could swipe your BT product and swipe your broccoli bed, spray the broccoli with BT, and then boom, your organic certification records are done because now you know that you sprayed BT on your broccoli in this location on this date. So yeah, you can fantasize about all kinds of fancy things with handheld devices. I know a guy in the Northeast who actually paid for having a couple of these handheld devices so they could get some detailed record keeping by farms in their state, and they actually had the same problem that we had using some of the paper forms that we had growers initially use, is that growers had good intentions and used the record keeping system for a while, but when they got really busy, it fell apart, and the same was true with the handheld devices. So I don't know, that isn't a great plug for for doing record keeping, but I guess it just speaks to how difficult it is.
Exactly. Well, there are certainly more and more tools out there. That is clear from what you were saying today. I think we're about done with the questions for right now, but please do, if you have follow-up questions, send them to us at info@ssawg.org on the screen there. And our time is just about up, but we will try to make sure you get all of your questions answered. We do want to thank you for joining the webinar today, and we would ask you to please help us out by completing the brief 4-question survey after the webinar that should be coming to you. As Julia mentioned, within 3 business days, you'll be receiving a link to the recorded version of this webinar, as well as a resource sheet that would be hopefully helpful to you. Remember to mark your calendars for the next 2 webinars in the series that are slated for November 19th and December 17th. And mark your calendars for the Southern SAWG Conference in Lexington, Kentucky, January 27th through 30th. So thank you all very much, and this concludes our webinar for today.